Welcome to this session on data extraction for qualitative evidence synthesis. Today we're going to be looking at the data extraction process in terms of how it compares and contrasts with data extraction for a quantitative review. Data extraction for a qualitative synthesis is a two-stage process. The first stage is to extract the contextual details that allow us to position a study within its study context. And so this will include such details as a population studied and their characteristics, the setting or context in which the study occurs, various details according to the methodology used, how participants were recruited, how data was collected and analyzed. And these are then the raw ingredients for inclusion in a table of included studies. And this part of the process tends to have little variation with regard to the method of synthesis that is used. And many people choose to do this at the same time as quality assessment because issues around, for example, recruitment are key in interpreting the quality of the included study. And then the second stage, which has more variation, involves extracting findings from the individual primary studies. And findings in a qualitative study are predominantly in the form of verbatim extracts. Some people call these quotes. They can be author interpretations. They can be higher level themes and sub-themes. They could be the generation of a new theory or observational excerpts from viewing participants in their context. And it's helpful to think of the different parts of an article where findings may be identified. Commonly, they can be identified throughout the paper. For example, first of all, in the abstract, there may well be summary statements or key messages, and there may be an additional online file. But as well as the center of the article, indicated here by the thickest blue arrow, where we have the more traditional narrative, perhaps tables, infographics, logic models, and we're not surprised to see findings contained in this results or findings section. It's important to note that findings can also be found in the methods section, for example, in terms of the selection of an appropriate theory or theoretical framework, and they can also be in the form of the discussion, where the author may add their interpretation to the data from the results or findings section. And our colleague Ruth Garside explained very nicely how qualitative findings may be identified. This may be the textual data from collecting interviews, observational data from doing an ethnography. It may be data from focus groups, but it's characterized by being in the form of words. Such non-standard ways of collecting qualitative data like photo voice have to be handled differently, of course. And so qualitative findings and therefore qualitative evidence tends to be characterized as textual data. And of course, this can appear in multiple places throughout the paper. So in this first instance, we have perhaps a typical idea of what data would involve, perhaps what we're typically used to in a qualitative article. So here we have two verbatim extracts from quotations from members of staff that describe the phenomenon, and this is clearly indicated by being placed within quotation marks. And in this case, the members of staff are participants of the study, and so these are what are known as first order constructs. But of course, not all data is in the form of the raw data from interviews. That may be in the form of summary statements. So here we have what's called a second order construct, where the author has imposed an interpretation. And so under the heading of privacy, we have an account of what two staff members had to say about privacy. and we can see that this is underpinned by data, but doesn't give us actual access to the verbatim accounts. But as we said, author interpretations could also be placed within the discussion. So here, the shared stories, in other words, the raw data, caused us to think, caused the author to think that the garden project had the function of expanding relationships between the nursing home and the town. And so this is something that may not be attributable to a single verbatim extract, but may be derived from a pattern of extracts that are placed alongside each other. And also, when we're interpreting findings, we need to try and place these in context. So, for example, it's very important to the understanding of the extracts that we've already discussed to know that some of this data is collected in a setting where residents were able to enter and use the garden, and that the garden was in its second year of operation. And so this contextual data can be said to be part of the findings, even though it's setting a frame for the phenomenon. It's not actually describing the phenomenon. And perhaps less traditionally, a theory can be described as data. Here we see, instead of textual descriptions of relationships between concepts, we see them in the form of a diagram, a conceptual model. And of course, the natural follow-on from having first-order constructs from the participants and second-order constructs from the authors is for the reviewer to superimpose third-order constructs, which are their accounts. And so this is where we take perhaps a pattern revealed by multiple studies and put this within an overarching explanation. And so this division of first order constructs, second order constructs, and third order constructs, although primarily used and referred to within meta-ethnography, does underpin our definition and understanding of the data that we're going to extract. And we can see the three main types of data that we may find ourselves using from within a paper. We may have verbatim comments where we can be sure or relatively sure that these have been reporting the experience of the participant. So we're convinced of their veracity, but there we have no accompanying interpretation, so we attribute significance to them ourselves from our own reading of these. Perhaps an alternative is where the author makes a statement and we don't have the underpinning data, so we're being asked to follow the narrative being described by the author. And here we benefit not in terms of the veracity, but in terms of the fact that the author felt that this was of note, that it was an observation that needed reporting. So we're getting something about significance here, or remarkableness, as we put in the slide. And then finally, we have, if you like, a strengthened form of data where we have the verbatim quotation accompanied by an author observation. So it has both the veracity of experience and the remarkableness that the author has selected that data to present to us. And then at a further level, when we string together multiple examples that may be verbatim comments, author observations, or both, then we can produce what's called a line of argument, a third order construct, such as the one shown at the bottom of the screen here, that's not attributable to any one single extract of data or any one quotation or observation. So data extraction is important in QES because we need to know about the participants that are included in individual studies, perhaps any differences, perhaps socioeconomic differences, ethnicity differences, anything that may help us to understand why their experience may be substantively different from that of other people or from the majority. And we also need to understand the context because all of us respond in different ways according to the context we find ourselves in, even when responding to the same phenomenon. We can appreciate that the methods for qualitative data extraction should be appropriate to the chosen method of synthesis, and that different methodologies are designed for different outcomes. So if we're extracting for meta-aggregation, primarily to inform recommendations, we may want more descriptive level findings, whereas if our intent is to generate new theory, then we will find ourselves extracting data to support a theoretical understanding. And increasingly, it's realized that this type of data it determines the choice of synthesis. So we need to have a clear picture of the characteristics of the included papers that we're going to be using and the type of data that we're going to find within those papers. So contrary to perhaps the idea that a protocol is something that is written completely in advance, we find that the protocol may have to allow us some wriggle room, some keeping of options open until we have a clearer idea of the characteristics of the papers and, equally importantly, the data within those papers. In terms of choices in data extraction, they tend to polarize around two approaches, either data extraction, so taking the data and cutting and pasting it into Google Forms or Word or into an Excel spreadsheet, or coding, where we work alongside the full text article, adding annotations and codes. And that can be done either on the raw data in Acrobat or a more analytical stage through purpose-designed software such as NVivo and Atlas TI that have been developed for primary qualitative data. And the data that is coded may be coded line by line. So the focus is on the individual meaning of that particular line, and we perhaps focus more on the word choice within that line. Or it could be extracted as substantive extracts, so perhaps one or two sentences or sentence fragments. And there, perhaps we get a greater attention to the context of the statements. And basically, although there could be variation within these two methods, thematic synthesis, as developed by Thomas and Harden, tends to use a line-by-line approach. Framework synthesis has conventionally used substantive extracts, attaching these extracts to themes from the framework. In terms of similarities with systematic reviews of effects, we can see that the data extraction is essentially a form of review management designed to help us take the complexity of individual articles, each written to different standards, and to turn that into a more interpretable matrix of categories. Context, as we've already said, is particularly important for qualitative synthesis. And specifically, data extraction is designed to help us to impose a consistent discipline on extracting the data to facilitate the subsequent synthesis. It also helps us to find data that will help us judge the quality of the study that we're looking at. And ideally, and as we'll see, this isn't always possible given that qualitative synthesis can be iterative, but ideally, we want to minimize the number of times that we have to go back to the original papers. So referring back to the original papers very rarely is a sign, I suppose, of us having anticipated our data extraction requirements more accurately than continually having to go back for additional data or additional insights. But as we've already hinted, there are differences with systematic reviews of effects. So a key principle of data extraction for qualitative synthesis is that it's not a one-off sequential and linear step. Typically, you're moving between the data that you're extracting, analysis, perhaps thinking of a possible interpretation, synthesizing to see if that interpretation carries across studies, perhaps then going back to additional data, perhaps to support that. So it's very much an iterative process. And indeed, some would argue whether we should describe data extraction, analysis, and synthesis as if they're separate steps, because that doesn't really describe how they're commonly enacted. But we find it helpful to do this for those who are perhaps entering qualitative synthesis from a background in other types of systematic review. So how is the process done? Well, perhaps most simply, extracting data. We extract data to data extraction forms, copying and pasting relevant data into each section of the form. There we would have one form per study, or if we were doing it in an Excel spreadsheet, we would have a row per study with multiple columns. And this enables us to look at the studies, moving away from them as individual items to looking at them as a set of studies. And in that way, it's easier to spot patterns. But for us to be able to spot patterns, it requires that there's some consistency about how data extraction has been performed. And so we would expect to have a commonality of the type of data within each uh, within each cell, some consistency in its format, and some consistency in the quantity of data. We wouldn't want, for example, to have some entries that are just a phrase, but other data within that same column as being extensive multiple paragraphs. And the particular value of extracting data in this way is that it helps us to use the data in multiple formats. So, for example, cutting and pasting rows or columns from spreadsheets into selective tables within our final report. But as the process implies, this can be a very resource-intensive way of performing data extraction. Alternatively, coding data, what you can do here is export data from the PDF into a qualitative data management system, or if you don't have access to that facility, then you could put it into an Acrobat editable file and use the limited amount of color codes to mark up the article as you would do with a physical highlighter. And this is very similar, of course, to how textual data is managed in primary qualitative research, where interviews stand instead of articles. And the advantage of these systems are that they're designed for the management of large volumes of text, and they're designed to support the analysis of the text in a structured way. And a very useful publication by Houghton and colleagues describes how they designed a data extraction form as a Word document and then imported it into NVivo. But they share that this particular solution was a bit limited because it meant that the PDFs, which they could also import, were separated from the data extraction forms, and ideally you want them linked so you have a clear audit trail between the more descriptive aspects of the data and the findings from the data. And they also experienced formatting problems through the importing, and they found that the assignment of themes, which they'd done from a framework in the Word document, needed to be repeated in NVivo. So benefiting from those cautionary lessons, they mentioned two alternative ways of using NVivo. One is to spend more time developing the form, so that it's compatible with NVivo and uses the headings and um, assigned features that NVivo has, rather than developing the data extraction form separately in Word. And in that way, there is consistency between the form they've designed and the functionality of NVivo. And if you go further, then it's not just a simple case of mapping between the use of the headings, but it's about using the full features of NVivo. And so that in the extract of the document that I present on the right-hand side here, they show how the different features of NVivo can be used within a systematic review. So, for example, the nodes being used to represent each concept or category. But nevertheless, they did find that the extraction form that they had used, albeit with the formatting problems, enabled application of the framework to their synthesis. So what are the challenges? Well, as we've hinted, data extraction has these two components, descriptive and analytical, and the software or existing packages that are good at handling one of these features may not be equally good at the other. So, for example, we see that Word or Excel may be good for the descriptive variables, but less suitable for the analytical text, and NVivo may have strengths in the other direction. Key to the process is consistency of the coding. If you're an individual coder, perhaps on a PhD project, then it's important that you code or extract consistently. If you're a team, then again, you are not looking just at consistency across papers, but consistency across the two or more reviewers. And as with any extraction process, or indeed with coding, it's possible that errors may occur. And so you need to think about a quality assurance process. And this needs to be commensurate with the resources that you have. So in a fully resourced review, you might choose to do double extraction. Under more constraints, you might just decide that one person will do it and the other will check. You may not check all of the examples. You may check a random sample, or you may be restricted to just checking key fields that you think the data is important for. And the other thing, of course, you can do through the design of the form is using drop-down menus or checkboxes so that consistent data is entered into each record entry. Methodologically, there are still some issues that remain to be resolved. We're still not sure of the full implications of choosing to extract data line or code data line by line, as opposed to taking out substantive extracts. As far as I know, that there has been no attempt to compare the two side by side. We've just supposed what the implications might be. Also, unlike the quantitative area, we don't know how frequently errors in data extraction occur and what the most common types of data extraction are. And so it's very difficult to put in place procedures to pick up on the most prevalent types of errors. And we don't know at this point whether these choices that we've presented for data extraction actually have a bearing on the review quality, or whether they simply relate to personal choice or preference and pre-familiarity with certain types of software. In terms of reading, we suggest 4 items. A chapter from the book by Finfgold Connet, which links data extraction with analysis. The Houghton paper, which is on use of NVivo. A Munn paper from the Joanna Briggs Institute on data extraction and synthesis more generally, but with a specific section on qualitative extraction, and the guidance from the Cochrane group on data extraction from the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. And examples are often helpful in this context. So workshop materials from the Esquire Sheffield workshop. The 2 appendices here one from WHO guidance, and the second from the Joanna Briggs Institute manual. And then finally, the references that we've made reference to throughout the presentation, particularly relating to the choice between extracting and coding. So thank you for your attention. I hope you find this useful, and please look out for other presentations in this series.